Hi, and welcome. Happy Thursday. Glad to be here. Um, I'm Susan Barashai of C Admissions, and we're going to be covering today the MBA interview for round 2, round 3. What I am seeing during this period of time is that applicants, even for round 2, they've started receiving invitations, especially for Kellogg, and there's an immediate relief. I made it. Then, about 48 hours later, the panic starts setting in because now they're looking at a Kellogg interview in 2 weeks' time, and they're realizing they have no idea what the schools are actually looking to get out of the applicant. So they do what anyone would do in these shoes, is that they Google MBA interview questions. They find lists of questions and they start writing in their answers to everything from what's your biggest weakness, tell me about a time you failed. And they're treating this almost like a job interview. Structured, definitely rehearsed, but also an element of defensiveness. And that's what makes people lose interviews, because the schools, they already decided that you're qualified if they have invited you to interview. So you got the interview, they're not going to question your GMAT or GRE, your consulting experience, your leadership examples. They've seen all of that. The interview is about something somewhat different, and the candidates who are really converting an interview invitation to an offer of admission understand that the interview demonstrates or is looking to see the strategic thinking of the individual in front of them. You're not there to recite your resume. You're there to show you're actually thought about what happens after you get in, what you will bring to the conversation and to the table. So that's what we're here to talk about today. I will be reserving questions for the end of the session. So wherever you're joining us from, whichever platform, I invite you to write your questions in the comments. Now, let's talk a little bit about numbers, just because they actually matter, so you understand what the stakes are. If you get an interview invitation, your odds obviously change dramatically. Top programs interview somewhere between 20 and 40% of the applicants. There are some who do more than that, so this is more just like averages. Once you are in the interview admit pool, the admission rates are about 50 to 60%, right? So just because you got an interview doesn't mean you're in. So think about that. You're essentially looking at a coin flip, except it's not random in terms of the probability. The candidates who are able to convert an offer of admission are the ones who figured out what adcoms, what the interviewers are actually listening for. They're not better on paper. They're not more impressive, because if you got an interview, means you are a strong candidate. They just prepared a little bit differently in how they showed up in the actual interview that made the interviewer convinced that they are the right candidate for that particular program. They show to the interview fully prepared, demonstrating something that not every applicant is going to do, which means they understand what's actually happening in the room. What are the admission committees looking for, and prepare with that mindset from the get-go, which makes for a massive advantage over people with identical application stats in the same interview pool who are approaching it like a job interview. So what is it that they're actually evaluating? So I'm going to tell you about a candidate who reached out to see admissions after getting waitlisted at Stanford last year. This person obviously had a strong profile because Stanford does admit only 2 people for every seat that they have in their classroom. She felt prepared going in, her answers ready for really every standard questions, but walked out of the interview confused about what really went wrong. When we talked through the interview, what became clear is that she prepared to talk about her achievements, her great stories. She had all the behavior questions ready, but the framing of her responses was wrong. She treated it like she was being evaluated on her past accomplishments, and Stanford didn't necessarily need to hear about those. They were trying to figure out if she understood what Stanford actually develops in people, whether she's thought through about what she specifically needed from that environment, and whether she could articulate how her particular background would add something to their classroom. She hadn't prepared for those types of questions at all because she's never thought about an interview in that way. Most of you are MBA applicants for the first time, and you haven't experienced this before. So it's really important to go in understanding the framing of the receiver before you, or as you prepare. This is something that the pattern of this particular candidate is something that I see very much constantly. Smart, accomplished candidates prepared for the wrong evaluation. So what we're going to do is we're going to break down what's actually happening in these interviews so you understand your framing of how you should be preparing. So first, they're looking for your strategic thinking and self-awareness, not just what you did, but why each decision made sense at the time and what you learned about yourself through the progression of your journey. Most people can explain their resume. Very few can explain why the trajectory led them to conclude that they needed an MBA now at this stage in their career, and why the specific gaps in their development require a structured program. Second, there's a contribution potential, or they're looking for contribution potential. They're not asking if you're smart. You obviously are. They're asking what specific perspective you bring to their classroom that enhances everyone else's learning. A consultant sees business problems differently than an engineer. Someone from nonprofit brings a different lens than someone from finance. But you have to articulate your specific lens, not just your job title, and assume that the admission committee is going to understand what you bring to the table. Third, understanding the program culture. And this is where culture is sometimes very difficult for applicants to understand. They don't understand exactly how that is measured. So oftentimes they think that culture, aka fit, means I research your program and like what I found. Obviously, I am simplifying that. But that really doesn't say anything about your fit in the program. So fit means you understand what the specific culture develops in people, not what they teach, but how they change how you think. And you can explain why that transformation is what you need in your professional journey and development. That's what separates admits from those who are waitlisted or rejected. So let's flip this quickly. What are they not doing? They're not fact-checking your resume. If something seemed inconsistent, they would have dinged you before the interview. So that's the process of your application submission that you should be making sure that it's there. They're not testing whether you memorized their website, when you say, I'm excited about Kellogg's collaborative culture and experiential learning opportunities, that tells them nothing except of the fact that you read their website. Everyone says that, right? And the big one is that they're not looking for perfect rehearsed answers. In fact, that's oftentimes backfires because they are interviewing a person for a cohort. They want to see who you are. And I see this consistently. Candidates memorizing responses to 50 questions. They sound totally polished, totally perfect, but extremely prepared and not like who they are usually. The interviewers can detect that. I can detect that. These are things that we see way too often. And it doesn't really come across as a conversation, which is what they're looking for. The candidates who do this process well, they prepare to sound like a conversation. The candidate is thinking out loud, making connections, showing how they process. It's definitely not scripted, but it also doesn't mean that you show up to an interview unprepared, unrehearsed at all. That's what AdComs are looking for. Can you think on your feet? Can you articulate why things matter, not just what happened? Can you demonstrate the kind of thinking they expect their admits to have in a way that shows that you're going to, again, add value to the classroom? Let me just make sure that everyone can hear me. Okay, great. So if you know now what they're evaluating and also what they're not looking for, how do you actually structure your answers? There is a framework that works across every question, and I mean every single question. Walk me through your resume, why an MBA, tell me about your leadership experience, all of them. The structure is context, decision point, what you've learned about yourself, and the strategic implications. You can follow the STAR method, but the STAR method must be layered with these points, these structures, in order for it to work. So let me walk you and let me show you what this looks like in practice. So walk me through your resume. I would say 99% of a standard interview will receive this question. So you need to prepare this in advance. You need to know how you answer a question like this. Most people are going to answer chronologically. So I graduated from X, I joined Y company, got promoted to Z, now I'm here. That is a timeline and not really what they're looking for. It also assumes that you do not believe that the interviewer is a professional who has read your resume in advance of your session. So a reframing of that question, or the answer to that question, is that you need to remember that your resume is a series of strategic decisions based on what you were learning about yourself and what you needed to develop. Each transition should reveal your evolution or your evolving understanding of your own trajectory and where you're looking to go. So instead of, after I graduated, I joined McKinsey, you would say, coming out of school, I knew I wanted to work on complex business problems, but had no idea which industry made sense long-term. Consulting gave me exposure to see how different companies operate, and more importantly, where I naturally added value versus where I was just executing someone else's framework. That's actually what led me to transition to McKinsey or whatever consulting firm. That is just one example. But I'm sure that you see the difference. One is fact, the other one shows self-awareness and strategic thinking about your career, that you are not just a butterfly just moving from flower to flower without any kind of rhyme or reason to it. So there's also the why an MBA, why now? 99, well, actually, this is like, unless it's a different structure interview, this is a question you will always be asked. So you need to have an answer. A weak version of this why an MBA now is I want to transition to tech and need the skills and network. Okay, everyone does that. It's not wrong, but it's just surface. Everyone wants the skills and network to make a transition to something else, something greater than where they are. Stronger version would sound more like 3 years into product management, I've realized the problem I'm drawn to aren't feature level decisions. They're questions about market positioning, business model, innovation. I've hit the ceiling on what I can learn on the job. I need structured framework and exposure to people who've made these decisions in different contexts. That's what I cannot get without taking time away to learn differently. That answer shows you've actually thought about what's missing and why you need a structured program to develop it. It makes you, it shows that you are someone who is thinking strategically and not just on superficial level. Now, you have probably seen those lists online. 55 MBA interview questions you must prepare for, or 100 or 150, whatever the number is. And honestly, I wrote one of those articles. It's on our website. You can go and find it after the session. It covers 55 common questions organized by category. But what the article doesn't actually tell you, and what I want to share here with you today, is if you try to memorize 55 or questions to 55 or answers to 55 questions, you're going to walk into your interview sounding like a robot. And even if you prepare 55 questions or answers to 55 questions, you are most likely going to be asked questions that are not on that list, right? There is going to be a difference between the robotic response that you've prepared for in advance and an answer to a question you haven't prepared for in advance. The reason why these lists exist, at least the reason why we have created a 55 question list, is they help you see patterns, behavior questions, career vision questions, school fit questions, ethical dilemmas. You need to know the categories, but the candidates who bomb interviews, they're the ones who wrote out word for word answers to every possible question and then try to remember which script to deliver when the interviewer asks something. And then they realize that the interview is conducted by a human who chooses to ask a question in whichever way they feel like asking it. Adcoms, interviewers can tell when you have a scripted response. What works instead is understanding the framework I just showed you, practice applying it to different questions, and going in ready to think out loud rather than recite. When someone asks, tell me about a time you failed, they're not checking if you have a failure story, although you should have a failure story. They're listening for self-awareness, how you process setbacks, what you learned about your own gaps. The framework handles that. The script, it's not going to. So use those question lists to practice the framework. Don't use it to write specific speeches in preparation for your interview. Okay, so here's where it gets really important. Not all MBA interviews are the same. Not all of them are structured the same. A Kellogg interview looks nothing like a Yale SOM interview. A Wharton approach completely different from MIT Sloan. And if you prepare the same way for all of the schools, and let's exclude Wharton from this. Outside of Wharton, if you prepare for all the schools in the same way, you're missing a major opportunity. So let me give you some examples. Kellogg does behavior-based interview discussions. They want to see how you collaborate in real time, how you build on others' idea, whether you demonstrate or facilitate. If you show up prepared to deliver polished individual answers, you are probably not going to deliver well, and you're not going to resonate with the interviewer, whoever that person is. Yale SOM focuses on community impact and their business and society mission. If you can't articulate how your career connects to broader social values, or how you've demonstrated this through the different experiences that you've had, even if you haven't had a social impact kind of job, you don't really understand what Yale actually is selecting for. MIT wants innovation and entrepreneurial thinking. They're less interested in perfect, polished answers and more interested in how you think about problems no one's solved yet. Same questions, why the school gets answered completely different between each of the schools that you're interviewing at. And this isn't about telling them what they want to hear. It's about actually understanding what each program develops in people and being honest about whether that matches what you need. And if you got to the interview, I'm assuming you've made the right selection, as understanding that you know what that actually means. Most candidates are going to treat top programs like they're interchangeable, with slightly different rankings and slightly different emphases. But the ones who get in and who understand there are fundamental differences about the experiences you're going to have there, and that develops different capabilities, those are the ones who are going to be fully prepared to really ace that interview. So what does preparation look like? Strong candidates do a few things differently. They practice the framework, not memorization. They take that structure I showed you and apply it to as many questions as they are comfortable, preparing for. They practice thinking out loud, making connections, showing their reasoning process the entire time. It feels conversational because they're not trying to remember specific words. They're demonstrating how they think every step of the way. They research school culture deeply. Obviously, you've done it one time in the process, not once, but meaning in the process of your submission. So you need to re-remember again, why are you there? You're not just reading the website. They continue to talk to current students. They sit in classes if possible. They read what professors are publishing. They understand what recent alumni are doing. They can speak specifically about what happened in that program that they can't get elsewhere. And that's really, really important, especially for schools who really care about who they're bringing in. And most of these M7, top 10, top 15 schools do that. They prepare, candidates who do this successfully prepare questions that show their strategic thinking. When the interviewer asks, what questions do you have for me? That's not a filler time. That's not I have all my questions answered by students. That is absolutely erroneous way to show up in the interview. The interviewer is actually asking you this question because it's another evaluation moment. Weak questions would sound like, what's your favorite thing about the program? But a strong question would be something like, I'm trying to understand how students here develop comfort with ambiguous strategic decision. How do the classroom dynamics push that kind of thinking? And obviously, if it's a student, you would say, how did you experience this? If it's an alumnus, again, how did you experience it? But push it a little bit further, given that they're out of the university by the point that you're speaking to them. Most importantly, a successful candidate is going to sound like themselves, not like they memorize someone else's advice. They show up as the person they actually are, with clear thinking about what they need and why this program fits, and are able to answer even questions they haven't rehearsed in advance with that same level of authenticity. That is what's going to convert an interview to an offer, and that is not something you can do in one sitting. All right, so where do you go from here? If you're interviewing soon, like you got in February, a Wharton interview or Booth or Kellogg that's interviewing now, we do one-on-one interview preparations, and you can stress test where you are, especially for your first interviews, because it is much more challenging as you're starting in this new journey. That's where we are going to work with candidates one-on-one with specific questions. We use our bank of questions that we have been developing over the past 10 years almost. And we will stress test, your responses and help you articulate what it is you're actually trying to articulate. You can schedule a consultation on our website if that's something that you are interested in doing. If you've applied to Wharton, you can also join our waitlist for the Wharton TBD simulation, where we do exactly a simulation of what that experience is going to look like. And then if you're early in the process and you're here just curious about what's happening and how your MBA is going to pan out, what do you need to do? And maybe you're still building your school list, you're planning, you're strategizing. We can do a profile evaluation, which is a written document, or a consultation to discuss your background and how we can work together. Either way, the big takeaway from today is the interview is where you control your preparation. You can't control who the person in front of you is, but you control how well you prepare. You can't change your stats at this point. You can't change what you submitted at this point. You can't rewrite your experiences either, but you absolutely can change how you frame your trajectory, how you demonstrate strategic thinking, and how you show up to schools that you are invited to interview. The candidates who follow this process are the ones who are really getting multiple offers of admit, because they've done all of this legwork necessary to showcase who they are and the value that they bring to the cohort. All right, so that is the end of today's presentation. As a reminder, we are having next week's session is going to be on the Wharton TBD. I'm just going to show this on the screen. Usual session, 10 a.m. Eastern time. So if you apply to Wharton, I encourage you to register. And then also, if you are a deferred candidate, or you know someone who is a deferred candidate, which is a senior in college or a master's student in their final studies, we are having a special event on January 21st at 11 a.m. Eastern time, specifically targeting those individuals who are applying to those schools. Okay, so if you have questions, I encourage you to write them in the chat. We have probably bandwidth for 1 or 2 questions. So let me look at what questions came through the registration, and I will put them on the screen. All right. Okay, so the first question is, and let me stop sharing screens. All right, so what is the most effective way to respond if the interviewer opens with an unstructured question that I did not prepare for? That is an excellent question. Typically, the interviewer, what we've seen with our past clients is interviewers typically start with icebreakers, which can be something you've done more recently. They may pull something from your interests in your resume, so you should definitely prepare for anything that you have presented in your resume, especially if it's a blind interview. You need to be able to talk about it, right? Now, if you haven't thought about the thing that they're asking you entirely, this is a little bit tricky, but one of the things that I would probably say that you should do in that situation, you would take a moment, think through the response, use the framework that we talked about in this presentation. So go back and watch that part, and then come up with something, like you're giving yourself a moment to come up with something that is closely related. I haven't, like, the process that we go with our client interview preparation is so extensive that no one has ever stated that they started in the wrong way. One time, someone had a GSB interview, and the interviewer started with something in there that they mentioned as part of an interest, and they were able to talk about that even though we hadn't necessarily rehearsed it fully beforehand. We've talked about it over the process of their application, that they were able to still answer the question effectively in that interview. So keep in mind, anything that you have on your resume, it's fair game. You have to be able to talk about it. So yes, you'll have the lists online, but those lists are generic lists, not you-specific lists. So make sure that you are not being so fixated on what's the list of questions that are online, and forgetting the fact that you have your own experiences that are unique to you. When we help applicants go through this process, yes, we go through questions that schools have asked typically, but we're also layering specific questions to that particular individual. What is unique about that person? What are interesting things that the interviewer can ask, and they need to have answers for? So keep that in mind in addition to the lists that we've shared about earlier. All right, well, thank you for watching. Good luck with all interview invites. Make sure, one last piece of advice I want to give everyone that is getting an interview: please do not rush to book an interview at the earliest possible. You are not getting extra points for doing that. You get extra points when you are ready. So give yourself as much time as you can to make sure that you are ready, showing up to the interview fully prepared. You don't get a second chance for the interview, you just get one. So make sure that you are taking the time, giving yourself the runway necessary for you to be successful in this process. Wishing you all, guys, good luck with the interviews, and I will see you next week.
Hi, I'm Susan Barashai, founder of C Admissions. If you'd like to go deeper into MBA strategy, watch the next video here. And if you want more insights on building a standout application, click here to subscribe.